this may be the last time you have a chance to hear from somebody who was around at the beginning. But what I want to start off with is this question. What makes you start a new party when there's other parties in existence that call themselves socialist, communist? Why would you start a new party? You can't just say, oh, well, we're going to start a new party just because you want to have your name on your rights or something, you know. And at the time when Workers' World was actually founded, that was 1959. But we had actually, the people who founded Workers' World, had actually been a unique political tendency in the movement for 11 years already, from 1948 on. And we were in another party. We were in the Socialist Workers' Party. And we were in that party for some important reasons, because rather than being in the Communist Party at the time. One thing is, there were a lot of good militants at that time, labor militants in the SWP, who had been quite important leaders during the Depression, during the 1930s. They led a general strike in Minneapolis in 1937, I believe it was. And then came World War II. And in World War II, the capitalist government under Roosevelt demanded of the unions, and got from the unions, a pledge not to strike during the war, and a wage freeze. It was supposed to be a wage and price freeze. But of course, the bosses have all kinds of ways to raise prices. You know, they have all kinds of gimmicks. But workers' wages, if you agree to a wage freeze, your wages are frozen. So by the time the war ended in 1945, people who had been working during the war were making what they had made during the Depression. You know, they were making Depression wages by 1945. That's why there was a big strike wave in the United States in 1946. Because in basic industries like steel, auto, electric, the workers were, you know, really, really heavily exploited. And these corporations were making out like bandits. I mean, they had gotten all the war contracts. They had, you know, from being rich corporations to begin with, they were now super rich corporations by the end of the war. The U.S. came out of the war, so, you know, practically untouched physically by the war, although a lot of soldiers died. But the U.S. territory was not devastated like Europe was, and parts of Asia were. So the U.S. ruling class was really, you know, high up on it. They were on top of the world. They thought saw the whole world open for their brand of exploitation. So when the war ended and this new period began, as early as 1946, the wartime alliance that had existed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was broken by, in a speech by Churchill, of all people, from Britain, who came to the United States and gave a famous speech. They called it the Iron Curtain speech, where he said, an iron curtain has descended over Europe. Now, I'm going into all this to explain why we had been in the SWP. Because during the war, the Communist Party was, you know, for the war, very much so. And they agreed to this no-strike pledge in the unions that they had influence in. And they agreed to the wage freeze because everything was supposed to be for the war effort. They didn't take a position that this was an imperialist war. They took the position that this is a war for democracy. So that was one big reason. It wasn't the only reason, but it was one very important reason why we were in this other party that wasn't under the influence of the leaders in the Soviet Union, quite the opposite. But by 1948, everything had turned around. The wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the U.S. was destroyed by U.S. imperialism. They were already, you know, making a big fuss over the fact that the Soviet Union was in Eastern Europe and wouldn't pull out and leave it up to them, you know, to just take over. the countries in Eastern Europe were devastated. They had been under the rule of the fascists. The left had been decimated. Probably some of the best people had either died in concentration camps fighting the Nazis, or they had gone to the Soviet Union. So when the war ended and the Soviet troops were in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union tried to set up governments that would be progressive governments. They didn't have a lot of human material to do that. And there was bureaucratic stuff that happened, but it was clear to us in our tendency that this was a progressive thing that the Soviet Union was doing, that they were holding back, had beat back the fascists in Eastern Europe. They weren't going to give it up, and they were setting up what they called, I think they called them people's democracies. But in essence, these were worker states as opposed to capitalist states, because the capitalist ruling class had been displaced. So in this party that we were in, the SWP, they didn't get it. They didn't understand this tremendous shift that had taken place. And they were very weak on some. In theory, they supported the Soviet Union as a worker state. But in practice, they fell short on this period of terrible red baiting that opened up. So we were a group in the SWP, but we were critical of policies of the leadership of it at that time. And I remember, like, Sam wanted to do things like go out and demonstrate for the Rosenbergs, and the SWP leaders didn't want to get involved in that kind of thing. I live right now just a few miles away from Peekskill, New York, which is upstate, and Paul Robeson, the great African-American singer, was scheduled to have a concert there, and I think it was around 1949 or 50. And the Klan and the cops and all the right wing came out, and they tried to beat up the people who went to the concert. Oh yeah. Actually, the town I live in, I found out, I just happened to live in this town, but I found out that some of the people who had guarded Robeson at that concert had come from this town that I live in now. They had gone, and they were on the running board of his car and the cars that were with him to keep the fascists from throwing bottles and stuff and breaking their windshield and all that. So it was a very tense time in the United States. The Rosenbergs were executed. The whole Cold War alliance between the U.S. and the USSR was totally history. It was the Cold War now. It was the Cold War. It was an anti-communist offensive. And at the same time, while the Soviet Union was trying to hold on in Eastern Europe, and as I said, they didn't have a lot of people to rely on because they had been killed. Most of the leftists had been killed under the Nazi occupation. So they were trying to set up governments that were not under the control of the right wing. But in Asia, something else was happening. Something very revolutionary was happening. The Chinese Revolution, which had fought the Japanese during the war, which had fought, against the landlords and the business owners who were lined up with imperialism, they were ready to take power. They were marching on Beijing and other cities, Shanghai, and they were ready to take power because they had built up this strong communist army during the war. And in Korea, there was a revolution in Korea that took power at that time too. So by 1950, when the Korean War broke out, there was this whole other aspect to the Cold War. There was now a shooting war in Asia, and what were we as communists in the United States, what was our position going to be? Well, we felt that it was very important that everybody understand the significance of what was happening in Asia, that there was all kinds of debate that went on in political circles. Were these really socialist revolutions in Asia? Wasn't there a really small working class and a huge peasantry? Of course, that had been true in Russia too in 1917. But all this debate, so I said, well, it couldn't be. And then this party that we were in, the SWP, they even took the position that the communist parties were they had no revolutionary potential of any kind anymore, and they couldn't lead. They couldn't lead a revolution, a real socialist revolution. And the Maoist leadership, when they took the power in 1949, they didn't call it a socialist revolution. See? So that was kind of an out for the SWP. They called it a block of four classes. But it was the working class, historically, the role of the working class in busting up capitalist rule that laid the basis for what China was to become. And the peasants were very revolutionary, although the peasants are not exactly don't have exactly the same interests as workers do. Workers, for the working class, when they're in a revolutionary mood, they want to get the bosses off their backs, disintegrate them as a class, take over the means of production. What peasants wanted was land. They wanted to be small owners of land. The Communist Party organized them, however, to not just be small owners, because in China, with so many millions of peasants and a limited amount of land, and they would have been very poor, they organized them on a more collective basis. First collectives, then communes, because it's more productive. And also you can raise the level of the population as far as education and health and all that much faster. So our view was that the Chinese Revolution, then the Korean Revolution, Vietnam came a little bit later, these were in essence socialist revolutions. In other words, these were worker states, which we had to argue for that point of view. The leaders of the SWP didn't agree with us on this. Now, I just want to say, though, that we never conducted ourselves in a way to just tear down the leaders that we didn't agree with. That was not the way we functioned in that party. We weren't based on wanting to put a personality up in place of another personality. We wanted to win the people who were in that party, and many of them were very good. People who had been worker militants from the 30s on. We wanted to win them to understand what our position was on Eastern Europe and on China and on the Soviet Union. That, yes, it was a worker state that had a bureaucracy, but it was basically progressive in character. And what was happening in Eastern Europe was that the opposition to the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe was coming from the right. Not that the workers didn't have grievances. They did. There were grievances. But the people who were organizing uprisings in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Germany, they were coming from the right wing, especially Hungary. So I'm sort of trying to, say quickly that we had very huge political differences with the leadership of that party. However, we didn't split from that party until 1959. And when we were in that party, we did everything that a party should do. We sold their newspaper. We made our contributions financially to the center. We had, we tried to have comradely relationships with the other members of the party because we wanted to win people. We didn't want to just alienate them. We wanted to win them to what we believed was a correct political position. And we thought that the leadership of the SWP didn't have a correct political position. So that's kind of a background to understanding that when you go to make a new party, it's a very serious proposition. Since we started Workers' World in 1959, I can't tell you how many leftist parties have started and folded in this country. They came up, especially with the 60s, in that period when it was sort of like now, in that it was a very, exciting period, and there was a lot of rebellion against the Vietnam War, against racism, and just young people, hating the stodgy conservatism of the older folks. But and then there were parties that were distinct from, say, the Communist Party of the U.S. because they were for the Chinese position, and there was a split, a political split between China and the Soviet Union in these 60s, actually. That had a very profound effect on the world communist movement. So there were those kind of parties. There were even parties that were lined up with Albania on some issues. I mean, there were all kinds of different political parties, you know. But here we are, and we survived. And the reason we survived is we had a very clear political view of the world struggle between the two opposing class systems, which has been going on, I mean, since the Paris Commune of 1870. That's the first outbreak of actual working class struggle and workers trying to take power in one city. It happened way back in 1870. And for a long time, you know, after the beginning of the Marxist movement, there was the view that, well, because the means of production were most developed in Europe and the US, that's where the revolutionary energy would come from for changing the world. But it didn't happen that way. What happened was that after World War II, the imperialist countries consolidated their strength. They pulled themselves back up on their feet. All the militancy that you had in this country of the workers in the 30s dissipated in the 50s, and the 50s was a very, very reactionary period. I mean, you know, just it's so different from today. You'd have to have lived through it to get a feeling of how stultifying and how horrible it was. But you know, the idea was everything was wonderful in the 50s. Everything was great, and workers' wages had gone up after the war. There were some big strikes, but the U.S. ruling class was making out so fantastically in terms of wealth from exploiting like half the world that they could afford, you know. Yeah, we'll give you a raise. I mean, it didn't have to become a huge struggle at home for the workers to get a raise. So I just want to tell you something. In 1958, I worked at a hospital as a lab technician. I had no previous training, none whatsoever. I had completed 1 year of college. We didn't even have a union yet in the health industry. But my pay equaled a month's rent. My weekly pay equaled a month's rent. How many, in a nice, you know, a nice apartment. How many young people can find a job like that now without going deeply into debt, getting some kind of specialized training? They trained me on the job. I was paid while I was learning how to become a lab technician. I was being paid, you know. And the workload was light enough that we could usually finish our work before the end of the day, and doctors would come in and they would give us like little lectures on various things that would help us understand the sort of finer points of hematology. And it's just hard to imagine that now, you know. Everything has gotten so much worse. At the same time, the productivity of labor has zoomed since then. One worker produces so much more than a worker could then because of all the improvements in technology and all. So just knowing stuff like that, you just get a feel for how much workers are exploited now. It's incredible, the degree of exploitation of workers. And they don't even need so many workers anymore. So half the population is scrambling just to be able to get enough work to find a job, right? So anyhow, some things happened in the 50s before we left the SWP that were encouraging in terms of because it was difficult to think of starting a new party in that reactionary period. Well, I mean, who was going to join a party that was more revolutionary than the one you were leaving? You know what I mean? It wasn't that kind of a period. So, but then came the beginning of the civil rights movement, and especially after the murder of Emmett Till, you know, this young kid from Chicago who, many black families in the North still had a lot of relatives living in the South, and their kids would often go in the summer, during summer vacation when school was out, the kids would go home and they would stay with grandma or so-and-so, you know, and spend the summer in small towns. And this little kid, 14 years old, he was murdered. He was murdered because he went into a little small grocery, and the proprietor thought that he was looking at his wife in a funny way. And the crime came and murdered him, and they did it in such a vicious way that when his body was sent back to Chicago, his family made the decision that they would have a viewing with an open coffin, so everybody could see what had been done to this child. And thousands of people in Chicago lined up to see the body of Emmett Till. And it was the beginning, it was the moment, you know, that the movement of black people against the racist terror in the South, especially in the South, not exclusively in the South, but especially in the South, got really, you know, known publicly, and there was a huge reaction to it. And then came the, you know, the beginning of the civil rights movement and the struggle against segregation and so on. So we left the SWP in 1959. And it just happened to coincide with the Cuban Revolution, which is another good thing for the survival of our small band of revolutionaries. We had people in 3 cities, and they were workers. It was New York City, Buffalo, New York, which is where most of our grouping was, and Youngstown. And both Youngstown and Buffalo are steel cities, were at that time big steel plants. And our comrades worked in steel, they worked in auto, they worked in Westinghouse, Electric. And they had, you know, a lot of trade union experience. And Comrade Sam Marcy, who was the ideological founder and leader of our political tendency and then of our party, he had actually studied for the bar, passed the, he was a lawyer, you know, he never practiced, I mean, as an individual lawyer, but he went to work for a union in New York City of paper box workers, and which was a very terrible, underpaid workforce, mostly immigrant women at that time. And he came up with it. He was really great, Sam. He had all kinds of wonderful ideas on, you know, how to carry out the struggle in a creative way. And as a lawyer, he knew all kinds of little tricks, you know, to keep the company from being able to get back at you and all that. And when before he and a bunch of the leading comrades actually came to New York City in the 60s, the early 60s, and said that, and that became the party center. But before that, when they were still in Buffalo, it was still a period of a lot of big strikes, and he was known in the city by all the members of the major unions as somebody to go to if you were having a tough time with your strike. And there would be times when the union leaders would be under an injunction that they couldn't talk to anybody, and especially him, and they would come over back fences and stuff to get to his house to be able to talk to him, and then he would think up good ideas for how they could get around various kinds of injunctions. I remember one strike at Westinghouse. No, it wasn't Westinghouse. It was Bell Aircraft. Bell Aircraft made helicopters, and so they had military contracts. So that put the union in a tough position because you were striking against the government and the war effort, and this was during the Korean War, right? But the workers, you know, were fed up with the conditions and the pay and all that, and they wanted to strike. So the company got an injunction against more than 3 pickets, 3 members of the union picketing or something. But it said members of the union, right? So Sam said, well, it doesn't say the children of the strikers, and it doesn't say the wives of the strikers. So we went, I wasn't even a child of a striker, but we got everybody we could, and we all went, and then it was all women and children picketing and attacking the scab cars as they came through and throwing stuff on their windshields and, you know, and all that. But anyway, that Sam was very creative, and he had a lot of good ideas, and he was recognized. You know, people, different union leaders who knew he was a radical, and they weren't, but they would come and have secret little meetings with him on how to proceed. So I just want to give you a sense of the fact that the Comrades were ideological, but they were also very practical in terms of the class struggle and in terms of other kinds of revolutionary activity at that time. So 59 came, and then we formalized the split with the Socialist Workers' Party, set up Workers' World. It was tough for the first couple of years because it wasn't yet really the 60s. You know, the 60s was great, but it was still 59, 60, and then the Cuban Revolution was 61. No. Yeah, it was 59. Yeah, it was 59. It was 59. By the fall of 1960, Fidel came to the UN, spoke at the UN. That was when his delegation was staying at one of the Midtown hotels, and the hotels, treated him terribly. So they went up to the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, and this was like a really big thing, that they had gone up there because it was showing solidarity with the oppressed people in Harlem, and just where they stood, right? And then about 6 months after that came the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the U.S. put all this money into the secret army, that they were training. The CIA was training them down in Florida, and also I think they had bases in Nicaragua at the time. They were training for an invasion of Cuba against the revolution. It was all supposed to be secret. It was all supposed to be just the Cubans who were doing it. The Cuban people hated Castro, and that kind of stuff. So we were involved from pretty early on in support for Cuba. I actually had a role in there was when Fidel came to the UN, there was a fight that took place in a restaurant in New York between Gusanos, the right-wing Cubans, and Fidelistas who lived in New York. This was all people in New York, and one person had a gun, and there was a shot was fired, and a little girl who had nothing to do with it, she was Venezuelan, she was with her father in the restaurant, was killed. So they arrested a young Cuban worker, and actually a guy who only had one hand because he had come to the United States for a job, for work. And 1 month after he'd come to the United States, he was working in a toy factory, he lost his hand in a machine. So he had an artificial hand. But he didn't even have two hands. They charged him with having the gun, which there would have been no reason for him to have a gun because he lived right in the neighborhood where this restaurant was. But the counter-revolutionary Cubans, they had, it turned out, been flown up from the training camps in Honduras, I think, Nicaragua, and Florida to cause trouble while Fidel was speaking at the UN to get the spotlight on something else, right? So it was clear that this thing had been set up. And I became the secretary of a committee to defend Francisco Molina, who was this young Cuban worker. And we had a lot of rallies and pickets and stuff like that. And then came the trial, and when the question of military training came up, and Molina's attorney asked asked one of these, all the witnesses against Molina were right-wing Cubans, every single one of them, asked them what kind of military training they had. The judge, or the government attorney, said, well, Your Honor, let me approach the bench. And he said, I can't allow my client, because it was his client, you see, he was the prosecuting attorney, and this guy was testifying on behalf of the government. He said, I can't allow him to answer this question on the grounds of national security. So, of course, the judge, who was a complete sleaze and a corrupt guy, just said, okay, so they never had to testify. Well, Molina got back to Cuba within a year. How? All the guys, every one of them who had testified against him, was captured at the Bay of Pigs. And there was an exchange for the prisoners. The Cubans got tractors, they got a couple of several other things that they demanded, and freedom for Francisco Molina. So he got freed. But we were involved in all that stuff, the fair play for Cuba. It was really wonderful to have a revolution to talk about, a real revolution. Let me see now. So, what were the early days of our party like? Well, we support for any country that had had a revolution, like Cuba, Korea, the Soviet Union, support for the worker states in Eastern Europe, but not overlooking the fact that there were a lot of problems, understanding that. And I want to say that, we didn't view these problems just as a result of leaders in the Soviet Union or in Eastern. It wasn't just that. If you look at it that way, you would get all caught up in, just, I don't know, conspiracy, I don't know. But the Soviet Union had a very, very difficult time after World War II. Very, very difficult. They had been, like half the country practically was destroyed. Everything, they had to move all their industry east of the Ural Mountains because the bombing from the German planes was just coming every day. The Germans had invaded with 5 million soldiers. The largest invasion in history was Operation Barbarossa when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This is before the U.S. was in the war. 5 million troops on one day, a huge front line, and just the tanks went in. They thought it was going to be so easy to overcome. But the Soviet people had rallied, and sacrificed enormously, but they lost a lot. And then they were the ones who actually captured the Reichstag in Berlin. They captured Berlin. They flew the red flag. You never hear about this in American history books. It's all like we, the United States, we defeated Germany. But it was the Soviet Union that defeated Nazi Germany. And for that reason, they had half of Germany was under occupation from their troops, the other half from the U.S. and its allies had the other half. And the same thing was true across all of Eastern Europe. But the Soviet Union didn't have much to put into these countries after the war was over. The U.S. started something called the Marshall Plan, where they put what sounded like a lot of money. It doesn't sound like much money. In those days, it was a lot of money, something like $20 billion. Excuse me. They put $20 billion into Western Europe to build up the economy and rebuild it after the destruction of the war. So conditions in Western Europe got much better, much faster than in Eastern Europe. And, when we think of socialism, what is it? Why are we for socialism? We're for socialism for the workers, so the workers can have a good life, and everybody can have a good life, and not poverty anymore. But there was a lot of poverty in Eastern Europe, and also a lot of the governments there were kind of cobbled together with people, who had been out of the country during the war. That's how they survived. So it was very difficult, and there were uprisings in Eastern Europe by the 50s, around 56 or so. There was a couple of them, and they were they were a threat to the Soviet bloc. These uprisings. There were a lot of workers participating in them because there was, as I said, there was a lot of dissatisfaction because of the poverty. But the leadership were all really, really right wing. Really, really right-wing. And so the Soviet Union sent troops in, and they crushed these uprisings. And that was, that was one of the things where we distinguished ourselves from other parties by explaining this and saying, that they did what they had to do. This was a real struggle, Do you want Eastern Europe to go back to fascism? And look at the countries in Eastern Europe now that the Soviet Union is, the old fascist parties. You read more and more about them all the time, right? Look at Ukraine. That was actually part of the Soviet Union. It wasn't even a separate country. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. There's still a struggle, a military struggle going on there between the people who, want to have people's democratic republics and the ones who want to be with the U.S. and just crack down on them, and are fascists. I mean, they trace their ideology back to the Ukrainian fascists of the when would that have been, 1920s or 30s, that the fascist movement started in that part of the world. So I talked a little bit about how our view of the world really was that there was a big change that had taken place. And that is that the revolutionary energy and the dynamism for revolutionary change was not coming from the Western, more developed, more industrialized countries. It was coming from countries that had been oppressed by imperialism, that had been colonized, that had been, underdeveloped deliberately by imperialism. And Sam wrote quite a few documents explaining this whole process. And also, he made it very clear to our party members right from the beginning that we had to understand the question of national self-determination from the point of view of Leninism. Because it's not just, it's not just that you feel, if you're not from the oppressed nation, that you just feel sympathy for people who are oppressed. It's not that. Yes, you do, but it's not that. It's not some kind of paternalistic, thing. It's that we don't believe that a revolution is possible without understanding the national question and national oppression. You cannot unite the working class if you don't fight national oppression. And certainly, this guy, Trump, is making that so clear. He's doing everything he can to disunite the working class. They're afraid of the workers in this country. This system has become so unstable now. I mean, if you look at all the economic figures, the Times just had an editorial yesterday about the tremendous poverty that exists in the United States now, and then this extreme concentration of wealth in the top 1%. They're scared. They're worried. They know this is completely unstable. And then with Trump coming along and ripping up the agreements that they've had with all the other capitalist countries and doing his thing, they're very worried. And you can see, I mean, the part of the capitalist media who speak for the big money that's not for Trump, like, they sound more radical than they ever did. I mean, they talk about the president, up until Trump, it was always that, well, you might be critical of the president, but he's the president of the United States. You have to say nice things about him, No, they don't do that anymore. They're pulling out all the stops. They don't criticize him on the right things. They put their emphasis on, stuff like, oh, well, he's attacking the FBI, or he's trying to get together with Russia, or, that everything but the real stuff that people here really need to know, which is that he's trying to keep us divided so we can't fight him and his class of billionaires. And he talks in terms of the workers all the time, more than the Democrats did. I think that's why he won the election, because he was angry. And for people who are angry at their situation and are not and hadn't picked up on, maybe had enough racism in them that they wouldn't be turned off by some of the stuff that he said. For a lot of the white workers here, they thought he was representing them. He was going to find them jobs. He was going to keep industries from going overseas and so forth and so on. So so he got the election, right? But he's doing things that I'm actually off the track here. I'm sorry. Shouldn't be talking about that. I should be talking about history. But anyway, what I was really talking about was the party's understanding of the Leninist position on national self-determination. And I remember at the time when the party was very new, And you know, there was a strong movement in this country at that time for integration, right? And for nonviolent demonstrations and so forth and so on. And that was all, you know, it was all to the good, but it wasn't like the struggle of oppressed people for national self-determination. It was for a change in the laws. It was for a change in the laws and in the way, you know, that black people would be treated. But it wasn't for national self-determination. Well, what is national self-determination? Sam laid it out. He explained how they had, what they had done in the Soviet Union, because they had not 2 or 3 different nationalities. They had something like 60 nationalities. People with, you know, distinct history, different languages, different religions, all that. In the early days of the Soviet Union, when Lenin was the leader, they actually created a government with 2 separate houses. One was a government, one house, the legislative house, you know, was based on proportional representation. So for every, you know, 1,000 people or 10,000 people, there was a representative elected from that district. But the other house was called the House of Nationalities. And every distinct nationality in the Soviet Union, no matter how small or big it was, would have representatives in the House of Nationalities. So this is a bicameral system. Now, we have a bicameral system. You got the House of Representatives, and then you have the Senate, which is just a millionaires club, now a billionaires club, right? Where they get elected for 6 years, the representatives to the House are going to get elected for 2 years, and really the senators, you know, they have the power much more than the House does. Although the House gets plenty of money from big business, as you all know, these politicians do. But it's just two different shuffling the deck, you know, in a different way, rather than addressing a problem like, what do? Where there are different nationalities that have historically been oppressed. How do you create a government that will address that and will begin to be able to take action to make decisions that are in the best interests of the oppressed nationalities? And he explained this, and this was like new. I mean, I remember, you know, I was like in my 20s at the time. I hadn't read Lenin or that, I'm afraid. I read a little bit of Lenin, but I hadn't read that. And I learned a lot, you know, because I thought of, you know, integration. I thought that was, you know, what was really what we were all for. He said, well, integration, okay. And then he talked about the Garvey movement in the United States, which was the largest movement of black people ever in U.S. history. In the 20th century, millions of people belonged to the Garvey movement, and it was a nationalist movement, and it wasn't for socialism or anything like that, but it was for national self-determination. It was for black people to have their own nation, and the Muslims, to a certain extent, represented something similar, the emphasis was that every oppressed nation has to be able to determine for themselves the relationship they want to have to their dominant majority nation. Do they want to be integrated? Do they want to be federated? Do they want to have a completely separate government of their own? It's up to them to decide. That's how you end, you know, how you move to end national oppression. At the same time, what does the Communist Party do? The Communist Party has everybody in it. And, you know, I mean, it wouldn't be a really functioning Communist Party if it were restricted to just people from the oppressor nation. You know, it's got everybody in it, but it has to have the greatest sensitivity to the needs and the positions and the political programs being put forward by the oppressed people, and especially from our own comrades who come from oppressed nations. So that was, again, part of our early training in the Workers' World Party, was to understand the national question and self-determination for all oppressed people. So what did we do on that? Well, I mean, We were involved, now that we had a party, you know, we weren't in some other party, we had control of our own party. We were involved in a lot of things, beginning in the 60s. Support for May Mallory and Robert Williams and the Deacons for Defense, which were black people in the South who were advocating for the right to self-defense, armed self-defense. And this was an issue at the time because the Klan was very active and visible. And in the town in North Carolina, where Rob Williams was the head of the NAACP, he was the leader of the NAACP there. He put out a newsletter and he argued for setting up squads of, you know, armed squads to defend people against Klan attacks. And for this, he was not, you know, he was like ridden out of the NAACP. They didn't want to go there. But there were other groups too. There was something, Deacons for Defense in Louisiana, that was doing the same thing. And this was when, you know, civil rights people were being murdered. Black and white were being murdered in that period, you know, the freedom rides and so on. So we were very involved in the defense of May Mallory, who came from New York, and Rob Williams, and I mean, Comrades even put up their house for bail for May Mallory because she was arrested. She had been in Monroe with Robert Williams when they were having big rallies of the people there, and there was a completely phony charge made by some reactionary white couple that the community had kidnapped them. What happened was they drove through the black community of Monroe while a rally was taking place. And the people knew who they were, and they stopped the car. And the people who were worried that something would happen took them and said, look, you've got to stay in Rob's house until we can get you out of here safely. Because we don't know, people are really angry, we don't know what's going to happen to you. So they were there in his house for a couple of hours, and then they left. They left the neighborhood. And then, I guess when the authorities, you know, found out what had happened, it turned it into a kidnapping charge. And this is why Robert Williams finally was forced to leave the United States. And May Mallory was apprehended in Cleveland because she had left Monroe, and she was in jail there. And there was this was a court case. So we were involved in that. We were involved in supporting for the Panthers, who also, you know, were carrying out the right of self-defense, armed self-defense. And there was also the Brown Berets was the same issue. And we were involved, you know, in all these things and trying to get support from the broader movement. Because by this time, there began to be, there was a revival of a broader political movement, a progressive movement in the United States. It had been crushed earlier, but it was back, you know, with young people, especially against the Vietnam War. So we did. I mean, we organized a lot of really great stuff in that period. I think one of the really great things that we did was in Boston in 1974, because there was a racist mobilization going on against busing. Some woman named Louisa Day Hicks was having rallies every weekend with like 1,000 racist rights opposing busing. But the black community was not of one mind on busing, whether they were for it or against it. Some people wanted it. They felt that their kids could get to a better school if they were bused to the school, that the schools were in better condition in the white neighborhoods. But other people in the black community said, well, we want to have our kids in our school that's in the black neighborhood with black teachers. We can have more of a curriculum that we could control. So there wasn't unanimity, you know what I mean? There wasn't like one political view on this. Plus, while all this racist stuff was happening in Boston, you know, which was where what was supposed to be the cradle of the anti-slavery movement in the North and all this and that, while all this was happening, what was happening with the Kennedys? You know, they were supposed to be so liberal and all this and that. Of course, John F. Kennedy was dead, but, you know, his family, they were supposed to be friends of black people and all that. There was not a peep out of them, and you know why? Because Ted Kennedy was considering running for president. And he was trying to get George Wallace of Alabama on the ticket so that they would get the Dixiecrat vote as well as the Northern Democratic Party vote. So there was this absence, of a political response to this racist stuff that was going on every week. And black people were being beaten up. A guy in a car went through, I think it was a Haitian man. He stopped at a light in a white neighborhood, and people came up and attacked his car, and he was lucky to get out of there without being badly injured. All this was happening. So our comrades talked to everybody, all the different groups, and said, well, look, what if we were to help organize a march that doesn't say we're for busing or we're against busing, but just says we're against racism. We're against racism. Because just to do that would be a big thing. So, it got a lot of support. Everybody got back on their feet in terms of like having an objective, how to respond to this racist hysteria. And 20,000 people came out on that march. 20,000. I mean, it was fantastic. It was so great. And it just changed the whole climate in the city. After that, there began to be black and white squads defending people, like black families that lived in neighborhoods that were largely white and who had been under attack just for living there. Now, there were people standing outside, black and white, outside their buildings, just there, just to make sure nothing happened. And really, the whole situation got turned around. It was really a great success. And also, another thing we did at that period, it was 68. This was before what happened in Boston. Boston was 1970. In 68, George Wallace, the Southern arch reactionary segregationist governor of Alabama, was running for president, and he organized a meeting at Madison Square Garden. So, and his followers, they came in from all around to fill up that thing. So we got a sound card and a lot of thousands and thousands of leaflets. And at that time, the area all around Madison Square Garden was the garment industry. And there were thousands and thousands of garment workers there working every day, in these garment factories. And many of them were people of color. And we organized, we broadcast the fact that this thing was going to happen at Madison Square Garden. And they came out against it. I mean, it was fantastic. They came out, a huge number of people outside the garden. Some got inside and disrupted. We got inside and disrupted. It was just but it was workers. It was largely workers who turned out for that demonstration against George Wallace. It shows you how the workers got it. They knew this was a big threat, that George Wallace could get a big rally in New York City. They weren't going to allow that. Other special oppression, because when we founded the party, we always had, within the party, there was always a very good attitude on the LGBTQ question, as it was called then. It's not a question anymore. But that's what it was called, the question, in the movement, the LGBTQ question. Meaning, where do you stand on rights for LGBTQ people? There was always a good position in the party on that, but there wasn't, at that time, in the very beginning of 59, 60, there wasn't a big movement out there, but it came quickly with the anti-war stuff and all that, and the whole new radical period. The LGBTQ movement began, having demonstrations and so on, and so it was important for us to be able to explain, both where the oppression comes from and where the oppression of women comes from, because there was a women's movement, but it was kind of it was mostly what you what got the publicity was a sort of a petty bourgeois women's movement, which was focused primarily on white women, primarily on women with, you know, careers and so forth and so on, and posed it in a way that it was like, well, men were the problem, and we had, you know, been taught to read Engels, and Frederick Engels, what he wrote about the origin of the family, because he, you know, he was Marx's closest collaborator, and he did a lot of research and used the work of some pioneers at that time to show that, for example, in this continent, before the European settlers came, when there were indigenous native nations here, there wasn't class oppression. That whole period of human development is a long, long period in history, and really class society is really a short period in human history, beginning with slavery, really, and then through feudalism and then capitalism. That the thing of the common entity of people who worked and lived together and shared, you know, everything together. That is how human beings evolved. That's how we evolved, how we survived, and universally. I mean, in all parts of the world, that came before class society. And there was this guy named Morgan, Lewis Henry Morgan, who wrote a very interesting book based on everything he had learned about the native societies in North America, and showing, you know, that this was an early form of communism that existed, but it was an early form where without all the technology that we have today, and so people, you know, shared what they had, but it wasn't a lot. And once technology advanced slowly, and there were surpluses, that was what class society came out of, was who was going to get the surplus. And paternity and being able, and the nuclear family, so-called, came out of that. Because when you had property that belonged to you, especially the male, and you wanted to make sure it went to your children, you had to know who your children were. I mean, in early societies, you know, no, it wasn't, who was the father of a child wasn't all that clear many times, because it's the mother who has the baby, you know, not the father. And she might have had relations with a bunch of people, and like a lot of people, you know. But once there was private property, then the family became restricted as an instrument to make sure that this property passed down to the heirs of the father. And that was the whole historical divide between men being dominant and women being oppressed. And also, at the same time, it was when all the negative attitudes came to anybody who didn't fit the prescribed role of being a man or a woman. So, now, you know, it's pretty generally understood that in early societies there were two-spirited people, people who wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't say, well, I'm a man or a woman. I'm a human being. I'm a human being. So you got a problem with that? You know? I mean, but to understand historically how sexual oppression and gender oppression came about was very important for the comrades of all gender identities, to understand that, and understand that, you know, part of our struggle for socialism is to go back to a form of society where private property is not a factor anymore, and we can all just share what we can produce in an equitable way, and you'd be free to live your life the way you want to, and you're not, you know, the vehicle for passing on property. And of course, in the bourgeois family, particularly, I mean, if you ever watch any of those masterpiece theater dramas about, you know, 19th century England and all the question of how the family, had to be held together, and inheritance was always such a big thing and all that. You can see, oh God, that's where it came. That's where it all came from. Anyway, so we had in our in the party a number of gay comrades who made real great contributions on this, theoretically and in practical activity. Bob McCubbin, who he lives in San Diego now, he's also a copy editor on our paper. He wrote a book called The Roots of Lesbian and Gay Oppression in Marxist View. And that's where he explains a lot of this. And this was a groundbreaking book, very much so, I mean, he uses other sources, but and he got a lot. There were other people who had done a lot of research, but he put it together in a way that you could really understand it in the context of where we're at now in the struggle against oppression. And then, of course, Leslie Feinberg, who is from Buffalo. She was from Buffalo. She was a worker in Buffalo. Her book, Stone Butch Blues, it's a novel, but it was very widely read by young queer people. And she was like a rock star. I mean, I once went, she spoke here at the Cooper Union once, and I went to this rally where she was like the featured speaker, and she had this great suit that she wore when she was giving her talks like that, and it was a young, very young audience, mostly young women, and they were just like jumping up and down and screaming when she came in, because for her, to them, she represented a real militant fighting attitude, not to be subjected to any kind of vicious treatment, but the right to fight back, to be militant and everything. And she was an editor of our paper for a while, too, Leslie wasn't. She died a few years ago. She had terrible illnesses, but that came from tick bites. But she was really fantastic. And her partner, Minnie Bruce Pratt, is now an editor of the paper. And Minnie Bruce is a well-known lesbian poet. So just so you know some of the people involved. So the party was involved in much of the LGBTQ struggle. And if you ever go down to the Stonewall Inn here, that was attacked by bigots back in, when was that?
69.
69. And they have a huge photo, I understand, on the wall that shows our big YOF banner. Now, what was YOF? Okay.
So it is 8:50. Just give me a time check.
We started an hour late, so we have an hour left.
So anyway, YOF. YOF was Youth Against War and Fascism. Because after we started the party, we wanted to have like a mass vehicle for all the young people who were not ready yet to think in terms of Marxism and Leninism and revolutionary politics. But they wanted to fight. They wanted to fight the war. They wanted to fight racism and fascism. We actually got started with a demonstration that was like, it surprised us. Our first demonstration was against a guy named George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the head of the American Nazi Party. And it was announced that he was going to come and speak in New York, and that was like, a big Jewish population in New York City. And that was like, what? Rockwell is going to come to New York City? But all the moderate, groups were saying, no, don't pay any attention. That's what he just wants attention. Just don't do anything, So they said, no, I want that. So we called for a demonstration. And I remember going up on the subway, but it wasn't a subway, above around 125th Street. It was an elevated train. And our demonstration was supposed to take place, I forget what to call the place, but anyway, it was like a big grassy area. And I'm looking out the window of the train just before I have to get off, and I see like all these people. I thought, gee, I wonder what all these people are doing there, you know? And then I thought, no. It was our demonstration, our very first demonstration. It was like 1,000 people against Rockwell. We got helped. There was a one-day teacher strike, and it was that day. So all these high school kids came. There were lots of high school kids. And it was such a contrast because there were all these young, very young people. And then also coming to this demonstration were people who were survivors of the Nazi concentration camps. And they wore their concentration camp uniforms, and they had their arms bared so you could see the numbers that were tattooed on their arms. So it was a very emotional moment, you know. Rockwell's car turned around before he crossed the George Washington Bridge. He never came into the city. But we got our organization off the ground. That was like 1963 or something like that, I think. I'm just going to say very briefly, because it's too late, but the Vietnam War. We were the ones who called the first demonstration in the United States against the Vietnam War, when most people had never heard of Vietnam. They had never heard of Vietnam. We passed out leaflets to people on the street. They didn't know what it was. They didn't even know it was a country. I mean, but there were U.S. troops there, and they were supposed to be advisors to the South Vietnamese army, but they were getting killed. So obviously they were doing more than just advice, right? they were in combat. And we did it. We held it in 1962, August, and you know, it was maybe like 40 people or 50 people, something like that. It was decent size for something that people were not yet, you know, like all riled up about because they really didn't know. And I don't think the draft was happening yet at that point, or maybe they were just getting volunteers to go there. I don't know, but it wasn't a big issue yet. But we knew that our demonstration was like really rang some bells because there was a paper at the time called the National Guardian, which was like a progressive paper, and there was a piece in it that was a message from Ho Chi Minh to the American people, and it said, "Thanking Youth Against War and Fascism for this demonstration." And that was the first demonstration against the Vietnam War. We felt very, very proud. 1962, August of 1962, yeah. And then, you know, just then the movement got bigger, and it was a question then of, like, the role we played in the anti-war movement was to always, you know, push it, because the leaders were pretty moderate at the beginning, and they, you know, they were calling for negotiations, that the U.S. and Vietnam should have negotiations in the war. And we said, no, you know, what are they going to negotiate? The Vietnamese give up this and then the U.S. gives up that? No, U.S. troops out. That's got to be the slogan. And we went to a thing where it was politically it was a really interesting thing. There began to be a big student movement against the war. And there were campus chapters all over the country. And they were going to have a national meeting of all these new anti-war groups. And it was going to be held in Madison, Wisconsin, because that was like the most active campus at that point. This was like 1964 or so. But then there was a committee for a sane nuclear policy. They called it SANE. And they were like the liberals, you know, they were like the liberals. But they announced that they were going to have a demonstration in Washington on the same weekend. And that their demonstration was going to call for negotiate now. And that they wouldn't allow, this was in the New York Times, they would not allow any signs calling for withdrawal from Vietnam on their demonstration. So, the thing that was going to be held in Madison decided to move their conference to Washington, D.C. for the same weekend. But they said nothing about this demonstration that was going to take place. What should they do? So it was very hard for us to get, it was about 1,000 people at this conference, it was a big conference. It was very hard to get the floor, but we finally, through various tricks and stuff, we finally got the floor. And we had the support of the Mississippi delegation to this anti-war thing, and it was an all-black delegation. And we proposed that they endorse the demonstration, but that the slogan be U.S. troops out now. We would go to the demonstration by U.S. troops out now, and we would bring signs. Well, the leaders didn't want to ruffle the feathers of the sane folks, you know, who haven't had the money and all this and that. And so they pushed it off the agenda. But we made 1,000 signs that night. The thing was the next day. We stayed up all night making signs, and we took them to the demonstration. And you know, here in New York City, you can't have a stick with a placard on it, but you could in Washington, D.C. They would be stapled on. And people were taking the Negotiate Now signs off their sticks and threading the stick through our thing that said, bring the troops home now. And the Times had to write about that the next day when they reported on the demonstration. They said, well, there was a contingent there that was for withdrawal. Because they wanted their own readers to know, their bourgeois readers to know, hey, something's happening here. Oh, well, I don't know if I should go on.
Please do.
Okay, all right. Wow, oh my God, I didn't talk about the ASU yet.
No.
So 67, we had been getting some letters from some soldiers on a base in Oklahoma, Fort Sill. And it wasn't basic training, but it was something close to it. I mean, they were soldiers who hadn't gone to Vietnam yet. And I remember they sent us this letter, and it was signed, like by 6 guys, and it said something like, yours for the revolution or something. And we were saying, wow, So we had in the office, there was a couple of people there. They said, what should we do? Well, let's send them something. So one of the comrades went out and got a can of mixed nuts. And he said, we put on it Party Nuts. It was called Party Nuts. It was called Party Nuts. We sent it down to them with a letter asking them, could we do anything to help? This turned into a huge struggle and eventually the formation of the American Servicemen's Union. Because we sent 3 cars of people down to Fort Sill, where one of the GIs, Andy Snap, was being court-martialed for having anti-war literature in his footlocker. A couple of our comrades had been down there organizing support from the outside, kind of like in this little base town, Lawton, Oklahoma. And they had been barred from the base. They had gone on the base and met with someone. It wasn't it was a basic base. It had no secret stuff or nothing like that. But they were barred from going on the base. So we had these 3 cars of people, and they were with us, and we tried to get onto the base to attend the court-martial. And under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, a court-martial is supposed to be public and open, and anybody's supposed to be able to attend. But they stopped us. We stayed the night before about 100 miles up the highway. And all night long, the house we were staying in had guys with walkie-talkies walking around. We could hear them. We get up at like 5 in the morning because we had to drive 100 miles before the court-martial was starting at 8 or something like that. Get up at 4 in the morning, get in our cars. All these lights go on cars down the street. We start off, we get to the highway. They're following us. We get to the highway. A helicopter comes in and just flies over us as we drive 100 miles down. Every exit, there was a state police car, and they would, come in and follow us. So then we get to the base. So they knew who we were, right? So we get to the base, and you've got to go through a gate. And they said, no, you're not allowed to come in. You're barred. And because we tried to go in anyway, they arrested Key and Marianne at that point. And because they had been barred earlier. They had been issued bar orders. We had not been issued bar orders. We had just been told we couldn't come in. So we drove around, and actually, it was a big sprawling base, and we found out that you could just drive around in another place, and you didn't have to go through a checkpoint. So we drive around, and we're coming into this, we're going to the Judge Advocate General's office. No, we were just trying to find, we were trying to find where the court martial was, that was it. And then we're driving and there's grass and trees and there's a couple of GIs sitting on the grass, kind of like this, and there's a helicopter over us, and they had a walkie-talkie, and all of a sudden we hear they had a Jeep parked by the side of the road. We hear their walkie-talkie sort of like that, They jump up and they come after us and they put on their sirens and all this and that. It was the helicopter telling them, "There they are, stop them!" So they took us to the Judge Advocate General's office. At which point they issued us formally bar orders, but which we refused to give them our names and we refused to take the pieces of paper. So they would touch us with the piece of paper, and then it would flutter to the floor. And one of our guys, Eddie Quendo, he was a very tall guy, and he much taller almost than anybody else, tall and skinny. And somebody had a camera and was trying to take pictures of what was going on in the Judge Advocate General's office while they were giving us these bar orders, And so they tried to get it from this guy, and the guy handed it to Eddie Quendo, the camera, and Eddie just stood there like this, the camera up there, and this colonel, who's saying, "Give me that," Eddie's just like that, and then the colonel tells one of his subordinates, "You get that." So you got a picture. So this little lieutenant or something is going, this camera away from Eddie. The whole thing was a hoot, and there were all these soldiers who worked there. It was a job, like an office job in the army. They worked there, and they were crowding in the doorways and everything, coming from all parts of the building, and they were laughing. And so we knew, they liked what we were doing. Maybe we could prevent them being sent to Vietnam or something, Anyway, those two comrades of ours, they spent 6 months in jail, each of them, federal penitentiary, for having violated the bar order. The rest of us, we didn't. We didn't go back on after that. But that evening, we met with the GIs, and we all went to a public swimming pool. We had a great time, and we got to know them. But then they set up the American Servicemen's Union, and by the late 60s, the American Servicemen's Union was publishing a newspaper called The Bond that went to 30,000 active duty airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, and would be read by many more because they passed it around, just like people in prison pass the paper around. But that was the American Servicemen's Union was. It had 10 demands. The right to refuse illegal orders, like the order to go to Vietnam. No saluting and serving of officers. Union wages for soldiers. No racism. No sexism. I don't know, there were a couple more, things, but they made up membership cards with those 10 points on them, and well, you've heard. I think you've heard our comrade John Cat.
John Cat?
No, Johnny.
Johnny Lewis.
Johnny Lewis.
Johnny
Yeah,
Lewis.
He can tell you. He can tell you about it because he was. She could tell you about it because she was one of the people actually in the Air Force at the time. In the Air Force, and used to get the paper all around, going from base to base, so it was very powerful, and it was able to get support for a lot of GIs who were, being court-martialed and stuff like that. So, I'll just end with this. Most of the big marches that took place against the war were there would be some sort of an umbrella coalition that would call them. We were not the main force. So it was, we couldn't get all the demands we wanted into these demonstrations. We could do our own signs, we could, but as the official things, we couldn't. But we did have control over one very important demonstration. It was a march on the Pentagon in 1982. We were the main force. It was a coalition, but we were the main force. And the focus of that demonstration was El Salvador, not Vietnam. This was after. It had 100,000 people. It was the first national anti-war rally that had a native speaker, an LGBTQ speaker, and a Palestinian speaker. That was the first time. None of the others did. Then, well, we organized a lot of other things too. I won't talk about them all, but we organized a Peace for Cuba rally at the Javits Center here in New York that was overflowing. Not everybody could even get in. And it was a very difficult time for Cuba because it was in 1992, and it was soon after the Soviet Union had fallen. And Cuba was really having a hard, difficult time, and it really helped in a critical moment. So I won't mention all the other things we've done on Korea or all that. That's it! Okay, so to answer Sharon's question about Dorothy Ballin, one of the founders of the party, was a really great revolutionary thinker and very thoughtful person who was also a worker. She also worked with Sam in their work with the Union of the paper box workers in New York. But then together they came to Buffalo. And she got a job in Westinghouse. She was a worker there for many years. And she fought to get women into the higher grades of the jobs there, because there was a process, you had to go through to get to the more skilled jobs, and there were no women had been gotten into these higher pay levels until she fought to break that barrier. So she was, very conscious of fighting for rights of women workers. But she also wrote a book in answer to the bourgeois feminists called Feminism and Marxism. And I think, it laid out, I haven't reread it recently, but I know that it lays out really a lot of the stuff that I was talking about in terms of having a Marxist approach, an Engels approach to understanding where the oppression of women comes from, and answering the bourgeois view on it. But since I haven't reread the book recently, I can't, maybe somebody else would want to comment more on that. But she was always a leader in the party of, really on interpersonal relations too. She did a lot of, talking to people, hearing their difficulties, their problems, helping them. And I think she established a culture in our party, understanding that people's behavior is often the result of tremendous difficulties they have in their lives, and that the party has to be sensitive to that and not take an officious attitude. This is the party line, you do it, right? But getting to know people, different comrades, and know, what special kinds of oppression they may face in this society. She was a tough person too. She was a tough person with a great heart. She was strong. She was a no-nonsense person too. How did the party respond to the collapse of the USSR? Well, first of all, the collapse of the USSR was not a big surprise to us, as it may have been to people in the Communist Party. Because, the Communist Party was pretty much decimated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they had always been very loyal adherents of whoever was the leadership in the Soviet Union. But they didn't, I don't think they had any discussions at all on what problems might exist and where they might come from. I mean, Sam Marcy was still quite young at the time that Hitler took over in Germany. And I remember him saying that one of the reasons he did not join the Communist Party youth at that time, this was in the 30s, was because this was a tremendous defeat and setback for the working class, not just in Germany, but in Europe generally, and that there was no discussion about what had happened in the Communist Party, and there had been a whole lot of political polemics going on beforehand over what was going on in Germany, because the two biggest parties in Germany were the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party. They had millions of votes. And then came the Nazi Party. And the attitude of the Communist Party for a considerable period was that the main problem for them was the Social Democrats. And I think they even coined a phrase, social fascists, which was not accurate. But because the Social Democrats were like, kind of like, well, I won't say they're like the Democratic Party exactly, but you get the picture. They called themselves socialists, but they were the soft socialists. They were the compromisers. They were the compromising party, and the Communist Party took a harder line, but with all the tremendous economic disasters that Germany went through, they lost the First World War, right? And they had to pay huge reparations to the countries that won the war in Europe. And that bankrupted the German economy. And I remember my mother telling me that there was a period in the late 20s in Germany when, if you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, you could take a wheelbarrow full of paper currency to pay for a loaf of bread. I mean, that's the currency became worthless. The whole economy just fell apart. So it was a tremendous crisis, and then the Nazis come along and they take advantage of this to try and direct the anger of the masses, and particularly the middle class, at Jewish people, Roma people, and communists, socialists. But they called them not socialists. They called the Nazi Party was the National Socialist Party. That is what Nazi stands for. They claimed to be socialists, but they were really, in the pocket of the big bourgeoisie. But they were, I shouldn't say in the pocket exactly. I mean, they were an independent political force working for the bourgeoisie, but were demanding, that they be in control. Well, that's what the fascists were. So there was a watershed election, national election in 1933, when the combined Social Democratic and Communist vote exceeded the Nazi vote by several million, 3 or 4 million people. Had they had a united front against the fascists at that point, they could have prevented Hitler from taking power legally. He might have tried to do it without that legal thing, but that gave him control of the state. The German bourgeoisie, through the chancellor at the time, handed over the keys to the government to Hitler in 1933 after that election. And Trotsky, who was had been one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, but was in exile at this point in time because he was opposed to Stalin's views on a lot of things, and that was one of the views of the Communist Party. He had been arguing that they should form a united front with the Social Democrats against the fascists. And the position of the Communist Party was, no, if the fascists get in, they'll expose themselves, and then it'll be our turn, which was completely, history shows how wrong that was. But, the history of the relationship between the Social Democrats and the Communists in Germany was very fraught. You know, I mean, there was not. I mean, there have been times when the Social Democrats betrayed the communists around 1919 and 1920, and was responsible for the murder of some of the leading communists. So there wasn't like, you know, but to not to try and keep the working class vote together, because it was the working class was voting for these two parties. And, the middle class was more like voting for the fascists. To keep the working class vote from being split and allowing the Nazis to get in, that would, you know, require some doing, but they didn't even attempt it until the very end, before the election. Then they changed their policy, the Communist Party did, but it was too late. It was, you know, they couldn't undo the damage. So that was a very big issue affecting the people who were in the Trotskyist movement, like the fact that the Communist Party had no explanation for the fascist victory was something that the leaders of our party saw around at that time, saw as a real weakness of the Communist Party. Now you may raise the fact that in World War II, and I thought, I brought this up in order to say this, and I guess I didn't say it. In World War II, when the war came and the Soviet Union was allied to the U.S. and Britain and parts of France against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, the Communist Party here, and I suppose in those countries too, was all patriotic for the war, because they thought that was how you showed, you know, support for the Soviet Union. And so they were for signing the No Strike Pledge, and they were strong in some of the unions, you know, and accepting the wage freeze during the war. Well, this really had a big effect on the working class movement in the United States. The unions that had grown strong during the Depression were much weakened by the war. But the SWP didn't take that position. The SWP took the position that they were not for that it was an imperialist war, and that the workers shouldn't give up their right to strike and shouldn't take a wage freeze during the war. So during World War II, the leaders of the SWP were jailed. 18 leaders went to jail for like a year and a half or something like that. And while the Communist Party was okay, I mean, the government didn't have an argument with the Communist Party. But then after the war, when the Cold War started, everything turned around, you see. And it was the Communist Party that was being persecuted, and the SWP was not. So, and they were being, the Communist Party was being persecuted because they supported the Soviet Union, and now the U.S. didn't have a relationship with them anymore. You know, they were enemies now. So that was important, and I meant to make that point. I'm sorry, I guess I didn't say it clearly enough. And you asked about electoral politics. Well, first of all, the way we look at electoral politics is that I think it was Engels who said, or maybe Marx or Engels who said that bourgeois elections can give a sense of the mood of the masses, can reflect the mood of the masses of people. But that's it. You're not going to win the struggle through bourgeois elections. But what you are able to see happening in a bourgeois election is very important to understand. I mean, you know, on one hand, we know all those reactionaries that voted for Trump. That's a really down thing. But now, the reaction, like, for example, this woman from the Bronx and Queens, you know, this young Puerto Rican woman, 28 years old, she just won the primary, the Democratic Party primary for her district, which had been held by one guy for like a dozen years or so, or more, since 2009. What would that be? No, since 11
years.
Since
20 years.
20 years.
Yeah, from 1999, he had held it, and he's a wheeler dealer. He's really a corrupt guy. He's a machine politician, and he just controlled that district, you know. And she won. He's out, you know. She'll be the candidate, and in the general election. But if this is a part of the city that always votes for Democrats, so it's very likely that she will get into the House of Representatives. So, you know, we look at that in this way. We say it's really good. It shows motion among the population that they would vote for her and come out for her, and, you know, get rid of this other guy. But she's going to have, if she tries to carry out her program in the House of Representatives, it's going to be a very difficult thing, and every kind of pressure is going to be brought to bear on her. But the people in her district are celebrating. I mean, they think, you know, they have won a victory. And in some ways they have won a victory. But it's not going to solve, getting her elected, or even a whole lot of people like her elected, is not going to change the society. It's not going to get rid of the fundamental problem, which is the capitalist control over the means of production, which leads to poverty, racism, and every kind of oppression. And probably also to some big economic crash at some time fairly soon, because it's not a stable system at all, and it's more than due for another thing than what happened in 2009. But on electoral politics, though, we do participate when we think that it's a way to get out and talk to people, you know, to find an audience, because people are interested in you if you're a candidate. I know I was the party's first candidate for president in 1980. 1980, yeah.
How can you forget when you were president? Because we don't think I'm happy on the president.
Yeah, it was 1980. It was the same year as Mount St. Helens, because I was traveling all over the country and I actually saw the smoke from the airplane. 1980. But you know, you get, it opens the, and that was not a very radical period. I mean, now we're doing so many things that, you know, we have to decide, well, do we want to do a campaign of the way, an electoral campaign, or do we want to do a lot of other things? But there weren't a lot of other things in 1980 that you could do and get many people involved in. But you know, running candidates is a way to get out your program. And we don't water it down. We don't do it for votes. We don't expect that a lot of people are going to vote for a revolution, but we get to talk to people and we get to meet people. And it can be effective and helpful. When I say we don't do it to get elected, maybe someday we will do it in order to get elected, the way the Bolsheviks did it in around 1908 and 9, after a big setback for the movement there. They actually got elected into Duma, which is the parliament, and they went in to bust it up. You know, I mean, they went in to expose it. They didn't go in to play nice and try to make a deal that, well, if you'll vote for this, then I'll vote for that. No, they went in to show the whole thing was corrupt and oppressing the people, and that's what they did with their electoral politics. And if we ever got to that point, that's what we'd do. And if we didn't, we'd fire the Comrades. And other parties at the time, or when?
The 40s.
Was that question about other parties?
In the 40s.
In the 40s.
Oh, in the 40s, yeah. Well, there was, the Communist Party was the biggest party on the left. The Socialist Party was a very wimpy socialist party. There were a few other parties besides when we were in the SWP in the 40s. Then after the war, when the Cold War started, there was something called the Progressive. Was that the Progressive Party? No, not Progressive Labor. There was a party where a guy named Wallace, not George Wallace,
Henry.
Henry Wallace, ran for president. What was the name of that party? Do you remember it?
Something like the Progressive.
Something like the Progressive Party. But he was a bourgeois politician. But he was running on the basis of opposition to the Cold War, to this whole big shift, which was turning into a huge build-up to some kind of a war. And of course, the war that happened was the one in Korea. But that was really the war that the U.S. wanted against the Soviet Union and any countries that had had revolutions. That was the Korean War in 1950. Well, in 1948, this guy, Henry Wallace, ran for president. And we wanted the SWP to support his campaign, saying it's a bourgeois campaign, but this is what's important. But they wouldn't do it. They ran their own candidates. So, there's times when there's an overriding issue and some big political shift going on, where it's not unprincipled to give critical support to somebody like a Henry Wallace. He wasn't a big bourgeois politician, but he was somebody who came out against the Cold War, and it represented forces within the U.S. that didn't want the U.S. to go into this big onslaught against the Soviet Union and the revolutions in Asia and so on. And that was important, extremely important.